Welcome back to another episode of Analyzing the Apocalypse. We are resuming our conversation about the trumpet judgments, and we are now at the fifth trumpet in Revelation chapter 9, verses 1 through 12, which will be the focus of our conversation in this episode. Just to briefly review what we talked about before was the four trumpet judgments of Revelation chapter 8, and also just the introduction to the trumpet judgments in general. So remember, all of this connects together. If we go back to the seven seals that starts back in about Revelation chapter 5, that takes us in through chapter 8, where chapter 8 then reveals the trumpet judgments, and we're going to see a similar pattern emerge when we get past the trumpet judgments. We'll see the bowl judgments emerge as well. And as a reminder, with all of these things, whether we talk about the seven seals, the seven trumpets, or the seven bowl judgments, which we'll get to later, these are all God's judgments upon an evil nation. The seven seals, I believe, have shown that pretty clearly. So far, the four trumpets that we've looked at have shown that, and I believe in this fifth trumpet we're going to see even more of that pattern emerge, showing us not to get too deep in the weeds of what this might specifically refer to, but focusing on the reality that this is God's judgment upon a wicked nation and his punishment for the evil deeds they've committed. So with that in mind, let's read Revelation chapter 9, verses 1 through 12, and then we'll talk about the details here, because this one is kind of a doozy, admittedly. There's a lot of details here that are very confusing and not clear of what the reference is, so we're going to break this down and try to understand it together. So I'm again in Revelation chapter 9 and verse 1, and we'll begin there and read down to verse 12 together. Then the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to the earth. To him was given the key to the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and smoke arose out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace. So the sun and the air were darkened because of the smoke of the pit. Then out of the smoke locusts came upon the earth, and to them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. They were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth, or any green thing, or any tree, but only those men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And they were not given authority to kill them, but to torment them for 5 months. Their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it strikes a man. In those days men will seek death and will not find it. They will desire to die, and death will flee from them. The shape of the locust was like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were crowns of something like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. They had hair like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. And they had breastplates rather like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots with many horses running into battle. They had tails like scorpions, and there were stings in their tails. Their power was to hurt men 5 months. And they had as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, but in Greek he has the name Apollyon. One woe is past; behold, still 2 more woes are coming after these things. Do you see why I might refer to this one as a doozy? Because there's a lot said here that does not have immediate or obvious references. Some of it does, which we'll talk about in a moment, but there's some questions that obviously come up as we read this. Right out of the gate in verse 1 there, the immediate question is, what are we talking about with a star falling from heaven to earth? How does that connect to the bottomless pit? Who is this? What is the bottomless pit? I mean, right out of the gate, we're having a lot of questions. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and turn over to our slideshow and talk about the details of the text so we understand what we're talking about here. So just to review what we've looked at, we've seen, again, a fallen star, which is likely a fallen angel. We'll talk more about that momentarily. So a fallen angel has this key that opens the bottomless pit, and then when that bottomless pit opens, smoke billows out of it. And that smoke is thick, it is dark. Notice that it's the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air are darkened as a result of this, so there's not a lot of clear vision going on when this smoke emerges. And then by the time we get to verse 3, we have these locusts that are coming out of this bottomless pit as well. But unlike a normal locust, which, if you know anything about a locust swarm, what do they typically go for? Vegetation. They eat everything they can as far as vegetation is concerned. They generally don't go after human beings. And they generally do not have tails like scorpions where they can sting people and hurt them that way. They don't really have that type of ability. It's not how they're created. So in this particular case, we're already being clued in that this is not to be taken at face value. There's more to be said regarding the locusts and what they mean, rather than thinking of them as literal insects that are going forth and doing this. And then, of course, we get down to verse 11, and we see these locusts are ruled over by a king whose name literally means destruction and destroyer. That's what Abaddon and Apollyon refer to as destruction and destroyer. So how do we even begin to wrap our minds around this? I want us to focus our attention to begin with on the bottomless pit and the fallen angel. But before we do that, once again, as a reminder, and I'm going to keep saying this over and over again, you're going to be tired of hearing me say it. We're talking about a judgment sent from God. That's what this is all about. Even if the details might be obscure to us or we may not know everything about it, we can say with absolute certainty this is a judgment orchestrated by God upon an evil nation. There'll be a very clear reason why we say on an evil nation when we get to the next slide in just a moment. But going back then to the fallen star and the bottomless pit here. So the reason I say that the fallen star is an angel is because he's referred to as a him in verse 1. And then verse 11 seems to be the same person as verse 1, because again, if he has the key to the bottomless pit, what would that indicate, biblically speaking? It indicates authority. We've already seen that, in fact, in Revelation chapter 3, where Jesus is said to have the key of David that opens and no one can shut. So key indicates something about authority. It indicates something about power. And in this case, we see an angel that is given that power. Even if it's not explicitly said to be an angel, he's referred to with terms that we would see associated with an angel. So I would say verse 1 and verse 11 clearly communicate this is a fallen angel doing this, not of his own will necessarily, or at least maybe not in his own mind, but realizing that this is God orchestrating this and bringing this to pass. The bottomless pit is a unique way to frame this, because the bottomless pit, in our minds, we think about just something where you look down and there's no end to it. I think the intention behind bottomless pit is the idea that there's no way to number what's in it, that it's just something that goes on and on forever. And that's why the Greek term for this might be more insightful, because it refers to the abyss. And the abyss, in at least Greek thinking, and even in the Bible, there's some indication of this, it's just modified. But the abyss is the place of the dead, or specifically the unclean and evil spirits that reside in the place of the dead. And you never want the abyss to be opened. That's something that, if you look into Greek thinking and the way that they kind of reason through stuff, they're pretty clear it's not something you want opened. And Revelation 9 indicates there's another reason you might not want it opened either, because of what is in it and what comes out of it. So the bottomless pit is that abyss. It's a place that is unclean, a place that is evil. There's evil forces emerging from this. They are empowered in some capacity, I would say, by Satan himself. Even though Satan is not explicitly mentioned here, I know, again, verse 11, people talk about Satan in that passage. I'm not convinced that's the reference. But nevertheless, I would say they are empowered by Satan to do this, although it is a judgment from God. They're just restricted and restrained in terms of what they can do and what they can accomplish. The smoke from the pit is an important detail, because the smoke very clearly, I mean, the details in verse 2 that are mentioned there about it darkening the sun and the air, that very clearly is intended to tell us that vision is obscured, that no one really knows what's coming. They're not alerted to this, because normally an event like this you would think would be significant. So people are going to turn their attention to it and see what's going on. They can't, because the smoke is so thick and powerful. There's no way to see what's coming out of it. So this is somewhat of a surprise. This is somewhat of a reality of they didn't see it coming and didn't know how to stop it or to prepare for it. So there's a certain aspect of suddenness to the judgment, is my point. And I think that's going to factor into how we understand this whole judgment to begin with. So then we go and talk about the locusts, because again, they're really the focus of the passage here. There's a lot of description given to the locusts more than anything else in this whole passage. I mean, really, if you go from verse 3 on down to verse 10, it's all about the locusts and what they're doing. The description that's given of them, especially just in verse 3, they have the power of a scorpion. A normal locust doesn't have that, so we could automatically say these are not just insects flying around. This is not the same thing that you would expect with a locust swarm that just goes through an area, chews up all the vegetation, and leaves. That's not it at all. So here are these locusts. They're not literal locusts. They're depicting something else. And in verse 4, we have another clear indication they're not to be taken literally, because they don't harm vegetation, they harm people. They go after people and the things that they're doing, and they torment them. And notice in verse 4, this detail, they only torment the men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And remember, if you think back to chapter 7, when that sealing takes place, when God has his servant sealed, the idea there is that God is showing his possession or his ownership over his people, and he's indicating they belong to him. This is showing us that when this judgment peals forth, whatever it refers to, it is going to be something that does not directly affect the people of God, but only those around them, only those who are in the world, only those who participate in evil deeds. They're the ones who are going to be targeted by this. And then we also find in verse 5 another detail that's layered on top of this, that they're not allowed to kill people, but only torment them for 5 months. that is another clear indication that there's more to this than meets the eye. This is happening for a short period. 5 months, biblically speaking, is a short period. It might be long to us, but it's a short period in the Bible. And the tormenting and the fact they're not killing them indicates this is something torturous happening to them because of their evil, because they are worthy of God's judgment. Having taken all those details into account, then we go into verses 6 through 10, and just to really quickly summarize that, these locusts are given a great description of what they look like and how they appear. And it's easy to read into all those descriptions, but we're just going to cut through that and just mention the Old Testament now, because I think that bears a lot more weight here than anything else we could say. So I'll mention for one thing, and we'll just briefly talk about this because it does bear relevance to this, because all the seven trumpet judgments really have a reference point back to the 10 plagues in Egypt. And we've already seen that with the four trumpet judgments before this. A lot of those had connections to the 10 plagues. This one seems to be right in line with that. The details are obviously different, and in the case of Exodus chapter 10, verses 12 through 15, that is obviously a literal locust plague that God was sending upon the nation of Egypt. The description and details clearly indicate it was a literal locust swarm. There was no symbolism to that necessarily. But what I'm saying is that Revelation chapter 9 picks up on that theme and indicates to us that there's more to this than meets the eye, but it's happening for a similar purpose. That although this is not a literal locust swarm like it was in the book of Exodus, it is still something that is a judgment from God, and it is a plague upon an evil nation, like it was back in the days of Egypt in the Exodus time. The other book that bears a lot of relevance here from the Old Testament is actually the book of Joel. It's a rare time in Revelation that Joel is referred to not in a direct reference, it's not a quote, but clearly, if you compare the two, you'll see similarities. So in Joel chapter 1, verses 6 through 7, and Joel chapter 2 and verse 4, you can see the same exact descriptions and same exact language describing locusts in Joel chapter 1 and chapter 2 as you see in Revelation chapter 9. And in Joel's case, he is not describing a literal locust swarm. He is describing an army that is going to come upon an evil nation, specifically Israel and Judah, to judge them for their sins. And God is arranging that. He is empowering them to do that very thing, to go into the land and destroy them. So, whether we talk about the 10 plagues and specifically the locust plague, or we talk about the locusts in the days of Joel and what he was talking about, we're seeing the same thing emerge. These are sent as a judgment on ungodly nations from God. And they are meant to reduce their power, meant to humble them, to bring them to the understanding that they don't have control over what's going on, that they are really in God's hand as far as what he chooses to do with them. So that's a very important detail in comparison. When we think back to the Old Testament, it really helps us to see what is the idea that's emerging here. And then I'll mention also something about verse 11. So again, we had mentioned this about how this is likely a fallen angel who is the king over the bottomless pit, or at very least, this is some type of entity associated with Satan who is doing this, who is named Destruction and Destroyer. That's just further evidence for the fact that this is going to be some type of power, some type of force that is going to go against an ungodly nation, harm them in a significant way. Although it's temporary, it's still going to devastate them to the point that, as verse 6 indicates, they're going to seek death and not find it. They're going to want to die, and yet death will not happen to them. So those altogether really indicate strongly this is, again, a judgment from God upon an ungodly nation because of their sins, and God is trying to bring them low because of what they've been doing. Now, having said all that, just one more thing I'll mention here in verse 11 about this fallen angel. The reference here is not direct, so I'm throwing this out there just as a food for thought. But in Daniel chapter 10, there is a reference from one of the archangels. I believe it's Gabriel in Daniel chapter 10 that comes to the prophet Daniel, and he was delayed because he wrestled with the angel of the prince of Persia. And there's some interesting language that's used there by an angel to Daniel, telling him some things that were going on and how Michael had to come and help Gabriel with what he was facing. I mean, when you think about the implications of that, it's pretty interesting just to ponder that and wonder what he was talking about. The reason I bring that up here in verse 11 is because if this is a fallen angel, it fits in with that idea that there are perhaps angels over nations that obviously we don't see. We don't know exactly what they're doing. We have no way of knowing what they're doing. But in some respect, either empower them or tempt them or distract them or whatever they happen to do and lead the nations as they want to lead them. And that God is sending forth his angels in some respect to rebuff them, to stop their efforts, what have you. I think that's maybe what you're seeing here as well. is that this is all within the hand of God, all within his great power. He is able to restrain or unleash as he sees fit. In this case, he allows them to be unleashed. He allows this fallen angel to do this and allow this judgment to peal forth, knowing that it's still within his hand to control it as he sees fit. And then just to briefly mention something about verse 12, we had talked about at the end of chapter 8 that there was this announcement that there were three woes that were coming. This fifth trumpet is the first woe of that three. And then, of course, the sixth trumpet is going to be the second woe, and then we'll see the third one a little bit later. So, judgment is the big, big theme here. But how should we put all this together? What does this actually mean? Is there a specific reference in history that we could point to? Is there some other way to look at this? And this is one of those cases I'm not going to directly come down on one side or the other because I think there's two strong possibilities here. And I don't know that it's possible to prove one over the other necessarily. I will say I lean more toward the second perspective I will offer you today, but I'm just saying that really of these two, I think both are strong possibilities. We're not talking about helicopters. We're not talking about war in the Middle East, as is often suspected with a passage like this. In fact, a lot of passages in Revelation are misunderstood and misinterpreted that way. So that's off the table right off the bat. But these two possibilities go like this. The first one says that this is describing spiritual blindness and the torment that comes upon those that are subject to it. We're talking then about idolaters, people who are lost in their sin, who are being tormented because of that and realizing how bad they really got it. They're not looking for a solution, mind you, but they are tormented because of that condition. Verses 4 and 6 indicate that might be the case. So in verse 4, we notice that the people of God are not subject to this judgment. They are not going to be harmed by the locusts that come. That may indicate this is not a physical judgment necessarily, that is something more of a spiritual judgment or something that's more of a mental judgment that God has happened to fall upon people. And then also the fact that the way this is described, it doesn't seem like an invasion necessarily. We're going to see in the next trumpet that there's certainly strong evidence that it's talking about an invasion. But in this case, it doesn't necessarily seem that way because they're only coming in to torment. They're not coming in to destroy and take away just yet. So it seems like this is preceding an invasion, preceding an army overtaking the Roman Empire, but that's not quite happening yet at the time of this particular trumpet. A view that I would lean more toward, besides what I just mentioned, is that this is really a reference to some of the things that happened in Roman history, and it doesn't point to one specific thing over another. But in the lead up to their downfall, you have a lot of raiders coming in from various places to harass the Roman Empire and really degrade them militarily. And what I mean by that is to say that you have all these different groups that were vying for power over the Roman Empire, and they all collectively, even though they weren't allies per se, they were attacking the Romans at different points and really trying to wear them down, and they ended up doing just that. And the reason I think that fits in with this is because it's a judgment from God. And we know that how God operates is he empowers different nations, empowers different people to overtake other nations that are worse. That falls right in line with the Old Testament and the teaching that we see there. And then we also have these ideas that come forth regarding how God degrades nations and starts to bring them low and how he does that in a progressive fashion. And sometimes it is all at once, other times it's not. So I think there's an indication of that. And the connection that we have back to the book of Joel regarding that was talking about a physical army coming into the land of Judah to invade and to destroy, I think that also is a good connection to make to see things in Revelation 9 the same way. So again, I'm not saying that either of these views are exactly what this is a reference to. It could be that neither one of them are exactly what is in view here. But I do know this. Very plainly, this is a judgment from God. A judgment from God upon an evil nation. It is a plague that he sends upon them to harm them, to degrade them, as a punishment for the sins they've committed against his people and against his church. That is what this is a reference to. All the trumpet judgments basically refer to that. We're going to see that in our next discussion in chapter 9. We'll see that later on with the seventh trumpet. We're going to keep on seeing that same idea emerge. So even if we cannot with exactness say this is talking about this historical event or it's talking about that historical event, I don't think that's what Revelation is trying to do here. I would suggest it's trying to show us that God cares about what's happening among the nations. He cares about what's happening to his people, and he will not abide their persecution any longer. And when he rises in judgment, he sends forth these plagues. It is horrifying. And those who are a persecuting power, in this particular context, the Roman Empire is almost certainly in view. But it could be another nation that is in view as well. Regardless, when God rises up in judgment against that evil nation, it is thorough, it is complete, he leaves no stone unturned. It is torturous for them because they refuse to repent. They refuse to change. We see that with the land of Egypt in the book of Exodus, that God gave them opportunity after opportunity to do what he told them to do. They refused, and they suffered as a direct result of that. Many plagues fell upon them because of their stubborn refusal to listen to the word of God. The same pattern repeats itself here in the book of Revelation. We see that happen so many times. And I think, just speaking broadly about the whole book, sometimes that's why there's a temptation there to try to say, oh, this is talking about this nation or that nation in terms of modern times. So, we talk about maybe Revelation 9 as a reference to a modern army conflict, and that's why these locusts are shaped the way they are. It's talking about helicopters or this or that. I think it's because history is something that goes in cycles, and it's something that happens over and over again, that there's that temptation to assume that it's talking about things that are happening in our time or that will happen after our time, when that's not necessarily the case here. I would not say that it's talking about our future or our current time in a direct way. It just so happens that because these things constantly happen over and over again, that it seems to be indicating that. But I'll have more to say on that topic a little bit later because I think there's a lot more in Revelation that shows that same pattern of thought as we go through its pages. So that's the fifth trumpet. We don't have a clear understanding per se of exactly what it's a reference to. We know what it's not, but we know this, that it's a judgment from God, that it's unexpected, it comes out of nowhere, it is detrimental, it is harmful, it degrades those who are subject to it, and yet the judgment is not over. Look back at verse 12 of Revelation chapter 9. One woe is past, and yet still two more are coming after these things. And that will be the focus of our conversation in the future. For now, that's all that I have on this particular conversation. I hope it's been beneficial to you to help you to understand this a little bit more clearly. And we'll talk again in our next episode about the sixth trumpet in Revelation chapter 9 and verses 13 through 21. Thank you.